All right, everybody, welcome back. We're diving deep today. You ready?
Always ready to dive in.
Our listeners have been asking about this for ages, so let's get right to it. U.S.-China relations, huh?
Big topic, lots to unpack.
For sure, for sure. We've got some amazing source material for this one. It's like a deep dive into these two global powerhouses, their political systems, how their economies tick, even their cultures. It goes deep.
Yeah, it's fascinating how different they are, yet so interconnected. You can't really understand one without the other, you know?
The source actually makes that exact point. It says the U.S. and China are constantly making headlines because they're like two totally different approaches to, well, pretty much everything.
Right, right. And it's not just about being different for the sake of being different.
Hmm.
These differences, they have real consequences. I mean, think global power dynamics, economic influence, the whole nine yards.
It's high stakes, right? One
Yeah.
move from either side could totally change the game for everyone.
Absolutely. It's like a constant chess match, but with, like, the whole world as the board.
So let's break it down. Starting with the basics. Their political systems. We've got the U.S., democracy in action, right? Elections, checks and balances, the whole power to the people thing.
Yeah, the classic model of democracy. And then you have China, a one-party state led by the Communist Party, highly centralized power.
Totally different approaches, right?
Mm.
But is it really a question of which one's better? Or is it more about understanding how those differences shape, I don't know, how they interact with each other on the world stage?
It's definitely more about understanding how those differences play out in their interactions, yeah.
Mhm.
Saying one is better is kind of an oversimplification. They both have their own strengths and weaknesses, right?
Right.
I mean, look, the U.S. system is great for representation, giving people a voice, but it can be slow, you know? Gridlock happens. China, on the other hand, can be super efficient. They can make things happen fast. But sometimes that efficiency comes at a cost. Individual freedoms might take a hit.
It's a trade-off, isn't it? And it's interesting, too, because both systems have kind of borrowed from each other over the years, right? China's
Ooh.
got those market-oriented reforms, and the U.S. has some social welfare programs. So the lines aren't always so clear-cut.
Yeah, you're right. It's not black and white. It's way more nuanced than that. And that actually makes it even more interesting when you start to look at their economies, because those political differences, they play out in a big way in how they approach, money, trade, all of that.
Right, because next up, we've got capitalism versus, well, socialism with a Chinese twist, as our source puts it.
Mhm.
The U.S. economy, it's often described as this, like, bustling marketplace, tons of independent shops, competition is fierce. It's like watching Apple and Microsoft duke it out, or Ford trying to keep up with Tesla.
Yeah, it's all about innovation,
Mhm.
staying ahead of the curve, the free market in action. And that's been the engine of the U.S. economy for a long time. It's led to some incredible advancements, a high standard of living for many, but, there are downsides too, of course.
Oh, yeah, for sure, for sure.
Like, income inequality has been a big issue in the U.S., growing for decades. In fact, the source here, it points out that the Gini coefficient, that's how they measure income inequality, well, it's at levels we haven't seen since, like, the 1930s.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, it's a serious issue. And then you've got China, which the source describes as, like, this giant mall where the government owns some of the biggest stores. It's a mix of socialist principles and market reforms and, well, the results are undeniable, right? Mind-blowing economic growth over the last few decades.
I mean, they've become the world's second largest economy in, what, like a few decades? It's insane.
It's remarkable, yeah. But of course, rapid growth like that, it doesn't come without its own set of challenges, right?
Definitely, definitely.
Things like environmental problems. China's industrialization, it's been fast, and that's put a huge strain on their resources.
Mhm.
Air pollution, water pollution, it's all part of the equation.
That's what makes this whole U.S.-China dynamic so interesting, right? It's not just about numbers and policies. It's about, like, two totally different philosophies at play, on how to organize a society, how to run things.
Absolutely. And those philosophies, they run deep.
Yeah.
Deeper than just the political and economic systems. They're woven into the fabric of their cultures. You want to understand these countries. You got to look beyond the GDP and the trade deals and really get into the cultural differences, how Americans and Chinese people, how they see the world, how they interact.
That's a great point. I remember when I first visited China, I was totally struck by how much emphasis people put on, like respecting elders, maintaining harmony within the group. It was so different from, the more individualistic culture that I was used to back home.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how these cultural differences, they show up in everyday life.
Yeah.
And they impact everything, from their art and literature to, how they conduct business. In the U.S., it's all about individualism, right? The
Sure.
"we'll pull yourself up by your bootstraps" mentality.
The American dream, right?
Sure.
Work hard, achieve success, get the big house with the white picket fence.
Exactly. And then you have China, with its strong collectivist culture. Family comes first, harmony is prized, and there's this deep respect for authority and tradition.
It makes you think about how different holidays are, right? Like Chinese New Year, it's all about family reunions, those long-held traditions. Totally different vibe from, say, American Thanksgiving, which is much more about individual achievement and, that gratitude for what you've accomplished.
It's fascinating, right, how these values shape their entire worldview.
It's not just abstract ideas, though, right? It has a real impact. How businesses are run, how people interact, even on a daily basis, almost like they're playing different games with completely different rule books.
It's a great analogy.
Mm.
And understanding those different rules, well, it's essential when we start to look at how the U.S. and China project their influence on the world stage. Because both countries, they're incredibly powerful, no doubt about it. But they use that power in very distinct ways.
So it's like, are they both heavyweights in the boxing ring, but they have completely different fighting styles?
Exactly. The U.S., they've traditionally used their military and economic power to exert their influence. Think about their involvement in NATO, their role in the UN Security Council.
Mm.
It's a very assertive approach.
So how does China approach things?
China's more about economic partnerships. Take, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's this massive network of infrastructure projects, roads, railways, ports, pipelines, stretching across continents. It's about connecting China to Europe, to Africa, to Southeast Asia. They're also big on soft power, spreading their influence through things like, movies, food, language institutes. Have you ever seen a kung fu movie?
Of course. But it sounds like this approach might be causing some friction, especially as China's influence keeps growing, right?
There's definitely some anxiety, in certain parts of the world,
Yeah.
especially among those who are used to a, U.S.-dominated global order. The source actually points out that this tension, it's really apparent in the South China Sea. That's where China is, asserting its territorial claims, building artificial islands, making their presence known.
So we've got these two giants, different political systems, different economies, different cultures, and they've got different approaches to wielding their power on the world stage. Does this all add up to a recipe for disaster?
Not necessarily. Remember, these two countries, they're deeply intertwined. They're major trading partners. Their economies are interdependent. It's a complicated relationship, no doubt. There's definitely competition, but there's also cooperation. It's a bit of a, love-hate situation. What's fascinating is how this relationship is constantly evolving. It's like watching two ships sailing in the same sea, sometimes on parallel courses, sometimes heading straight for a collision.
It's like that friend you compete with and everything, but also kind of need them for your study group,
Yeah, exactly. But let's be real, there are some serious points of friction here. Our source dives into this, talks about trade wars, intellectual property disputes. There are concerns about China's military modernization, too. It's all a delicate balancing act, and the stakes are incredibly high.
And then there's that whole tech race, right? Our source mentions it. The US and China, they're battling it out for dominance in artificial intelligence, 5G, all that cutting edge stuff.
Oh yeah, the U.S. recently imposed restrictions on exports of advanced semiconductor chips to China. They're worried about them being used for military applications, which has really slowed down China's progress in developing their own domestic chip industry.
So trade, technology, those are major flashpoints. But are there any areas where, I don't know, where the US and China might actually find some common ground?
There are actually a few, believe it or not. Climate change is a big one. Both countries are major emitters of greenhouse gases, so they both have a real interest in tackling this global challenge.
It's one of those issues where they really are in the same boat, right? Have you noticed how climate change is impacting your local area? Maybe you've seen changes in weather patterns or experienced more extreme weather events?
Absolutely, and we've seen some signs of cooperation on climate change in the past, so there's potential for more progress there. Another area is global health security, especially after that whole COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic really showed us just how interconnected the world is and how important global cooperation is when it comes to addressing health threats.
Couldn't agree more. The U.S. and China could totally work together on things like disease surveillance, developing vaccines, being prepared for future pandemics. Actually, the source material points out a few times where they have collaborated on public health initiatives in the past.
So it's not all doom and gloom, right? There's some hope for cooperation, even amidst all the competition.
Exactly. The key is to manage that competition, prevent from spiraling out of control, and seize those opportunities to work together when they pop up.
That sounds like a pretty tall order. Zooming out a bit, what are some of the key takeaways from all of this? What should our listeners be paying attention to as this whole relationship unfolds?
I think one of the most important things to remember is this isn't a zero-sum game. People often frame it as this rivalry, a battle for supremacy. And yeah, there's competition, but it's not as simple as one side winning and the other losing. The reality is much more nuanced. The U.S. and China, they're interconnected in so many ways. Their fates are intertwined. They need each other, even as they compete.
It's a complicated dance, right? Moments of harmony, moments of tension.
That's a great way to put it. Another key takeaway is we need to move beyond those simplistic narratives. The China is a threat narrative or the America is in decline narrative. Those are often driven by fear or political agendas. The reality is much more complex than those narratives would suggest.
So we need to be a bit more critical of the information we're getting about this relationship.
Absolutely. We need to look beyond the headlines, do our own research, and try to really understand the complexities. There aren't any easy answers or black and white solutions. We have to be willing to engage with different perspectives, challenge our own assumptions, and embrace the nuances.
Which is exactly what we're trying to do here on the deep dive.
Exactly. And that brings me to the third key takeaway. The future of this relationship, it's not set in stone. It's not a foregone conclusion that the U.S. and China are headed for conflict.
So there's still hope for a more cooperative future.
There's always hope. It all comes down to the choices both sides make, the policies they pursue, and how they manage their differences. It's going to take diplomacy, communication, a real willingness to find common ground.
What do you think? Based on what we've learned from the source material today, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations? I'm feeling, I don't know, cautiously optimistic. The source material really highlights both the challenges and the opportunities. It's clear the U.S. and China have some fundamental differences, but they also have some shared interests. And they've shown they can cooperate when it benefits them both.
That's a great observation. And I think that cautious optimism, it's a good place to start. This is a long game, one that's going to have a huge impact on generations to come.
Let's say our listeners have absorbed all this information. They're starting to see the complexities of the U.S.-China relationship. What's the next step? Where can they go from here?
Well, there are tons of resources out there for people who want to learn more. Books, articles, documentaries, podcasts. The information is out there.
And don't forget about good old-fashioned conversations.
Exactly. Talk to people who have different viewpoints.
Mm.
Seek out diverse perspective. And don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. It's through dialogue and critical thinking that we can really start to wrap our heads around this complex and constantly changing relationship.
So in a nutshell, we're saying U.S.-China relations are a big deal, it's complicated, and it's definitely worth paying attention to.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Now, you mentioned that this relationship is constantly changing. Are there any specific trends or developments you think our listeners should keep an eye on in the coming months and years?
Oh, absolutely. There are a bunch of key areas where we're likely to see some major developments.
Okay, hit me with them.
Well, first, there's the ongoing trade war. The tariffs imposed by both sides, they've really messed with global supply chains and created a lot of uncertainty in the global economy. It's still up in the air whether they can reach a trade deal that addresses everyone's concerns. What do you think? Do you think they can reach a deal? What do you think are some of the main roadblocks?
I think the biggest roadblock is trust. There's a lot of mistrust between the two sides, and it's tough to negotiate when you don't really believe the other side is being straight with you.
You're not wrong. And our source actually goes into the history of this mistrust, which goes way back. It's not something that's going to be solved overnight.
So trade's a major flashpoint, but what about the tech race? We were talking about how the U.S. and China are competing for dominance in artificial intelligence, 5G, all those cutting-edge technologies. What's the latest on that front?
That competition is only getting more intense. Both countries are pouring money into research and development, and they both increasingly see technological supremacy as a national security issue. We're probably going to see more restrictions on sharing technology, more accusations of espionage, and maybe even a complete decoupling of their tech ecosystems.
It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? But it's the world we live in now.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole geopolitical dimension. The U.S. and China are both vying for influence in key regions around the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific.
Our source mentioned the South China Sea as a particularly tense area. What makes it so strategically important?
Well, for one thing, it's a major shipping route. It's also thought to have a lot of oil and natural gas. China claims most of the sea is its own, but those claims are disputed by several of its neighbors like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. The U.S. is really invested in making sure everyone can navigate freely in the South China Sea, so they regularly conduct military operations there, which of course China sees as provocative. It's a really volatile situation, one where things could easily escalate.
So we've got trade, technology, geopolitics, lots of potential flashpoints. But are there any areas where the U.S. and China might actually be able to find some common ground?
We touched on this earlier, but yeah, there are a few areas where cooperation isn't just possible, it's essential. Climate change is a big one, as is global health security. Another area where we might see more cooperation is global economic governance. Both the U.S. and China are members of the G20, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. They both have a stake in keeping the global financial system stable.
That makes sense. But how can they cooperate effectively when their economic systems are so different?
It's definitely a challenge. But remember, like we talked about earlier, China's economic system isn't pure socialism, and the U.S. economy isn't pure capitalism.
Yeah.
There's more overlap than you might think, and they've both shown that they're willing to compromise, like they did during the 2008 financial crisis.
So there's hope for a more cooperative future then?
I'd say so,
Mhm.
but it'll require a change in mindset on both sides. They need to move away from that us versus them thinking and recognize that working together can actually benefit them both.
So we've talked about the past, the present, and the future of the U.S.-China relationship. Let's bring it back to the individual level for a minute. What can our listeners do to stay informed about this complex and always changing relationship?
That's a great question. The most important thing is to stay critical. Don't just passively absorb whatever news and information comes your way. Question everything. Look at things from different perspectives. Think about where your information is coming from, and try to be aware of your own biases.
So be an active participant in the information landscape, not just a passive recipient.
Exactly. And don't shy away from conversations with people who have different opinions. It's through those conversations, those respectful debates, that we can refine our own understanding and challenge our own assumptions.
Remember, folks, this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Well said. The U.S.-China relationship is going to be a defining feature of the 21st century, and it's one that we're all going to be dealing with for years to come.
Buckle up, everybody. It's going to be a wild ride.
It will be, but it's also an incredibly fascinating and important ride.
Okay. I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We definitely have. We've explored the history of U.S.-China relations, dove into the complexities of their political systems, their economies, their cultures. We've looked at their competing visions for the world order, and we've considered the potential flashpoints and the opportunities for cooperation.
It's been quite the journey, and I hope our listeners are feeling a bit more informed and a lot more curious about this fascinating topic.
Me too. The more we understand about the U.S.-China relationship, the better prepared we'll be to navigate the challenges and the opportunities of the 21st century.
Well said. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
Ooh, I love a good thought-provoking question. Hit me with it.
Imagine a world where the U.S. and China figure out how to genuinely cooperate, not just on things like climate change and global health, but on a much broader scale. What would that world look like? What opportunities would it create? And what new challenges might it bring?
That's a fantastic question. I hope our listeners will spend some time really thinking about that one.
Because ultimately, the future of U.S.-China relations isn't predetermined. We all have a role to play in shaping it.
And that's a responsibility we should all take seriously.
It's like we've given them this puzzle, and now it's their turn to see if they can fit the pieces together.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe they'll come up with some solutions we haven't even thought of. That's what's cool about human ingenuity, right?
For sure. So as we wrap up our deep dive into U.S.-China relations, I think we can all agree this is a topic that'll keep us busy for a long time.
Oh, yeah. It's not going away anytime soon. I hope our listeners will keep digging into this topic, keep learning, asking those tough questions, and most importantly, challenging what they think they know. The more we all understand about this relationship, the better we can handle the challenges and seize the opportunities of this crazy century we're in.
You know what? Maybe some of our listeners out there will even play a role in shaping this whole relationship, making it work better. Remember, the future isn't set in stone. We create it.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been fun.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.